Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeremy Ashby. I'm the Head Properties Curator at English Heritage and your host for this evening's Members Lecture. This is the series that takes you right to the heart of heritage with insights and stories directly from our expert historians and curators. The Iron Bridge opened to the public on New Year's Day 1781. Almost 250 years before this, King Henry VIII brought about the dissolution of the monasteries, which saw the wholesale redistribution of land and the mineral wealth they held into secular hands. Today, 250 years after the bridge opened to the public, we live in a world that, on the surface at least, has benefited greatly from the Industrial Revolution. But we find ourselves having to manage an increasing number of negative impacts on the environment, climate, and society that stem directly or indirectly from the advances of the 18th century. The Iron Bridge is literally and figuratively at the heart of a long industrial revolution that spans 500 years from the Reformation to today. The changes wrought in the East Shropshire coalfield and beyond have had far-reaching consequences and demonstrate the ways in which the past still shapes our present and our future. To tell us more about the Iron Bridge and its place at the heart of industry tonight is Dr. Matt Thompson, our interim curatorial director. Prior to his current role, Matt had been our head collections curator since 2015, managing and developing English Heritage's historic artifact collections through programs of stewardship, research, and presentation schemes. Before that, he worked at various museums, including the Quilt Museum and Gallery, the National Railway Museum in York, and perhaps most relevant to tonight, at the Ironbridge Gorge Museum Trust. So who better to tell us about the historic Iron Bridge? Before I hand you over, 3 quick housekeeping points. First, you can send us your questions by sending us a message on the right-hand side of the screen. We'll aim to cover as many of these as possible at the end of our lecture. Second, during the lecture, a donation button should pop up on your screen. As a member, you already do so much to help us share the benefits of heritage with as many people as we can. But if you can please consider making a donation to help us make even more of a difference, please do. Thirdly, we're joined again by our British Sign Language interpreters, who are helping us make these lectures as accessible as possible. And as ever, we're broadcasting live, so please bear with us if we have any technical issues. And if sound is a particular issue, after the lecture, you'll be able to watch the lectures in the members area of our website with subtitles. Thank you. And with that, I'll hand over to Matt.
Thank you, Jeremy. Before I begin, there's 2 things I'd like to say. The first is, you might be able to tell, I'm suffering from a little bit of a cough, the tail end of a cold. So you'll be proud of me to know that I'm going to be soldiering on tonight, but I might get a little bit squeaky as we get further on into the lecture, and I might end up clearing my throat a few times. So my apologies for that. It must be as frustrating for you as it is for me. And then the second thing I'd like to say is I'd really like to express my thanks to the Ironbridge Gorge Museum Trust for their generosity and their time in providing so many of the images for tonight's lecture. And you'll see they've been credited on the images that we used there. Right, here we go. So most of us will be familiar with the Arthur C. Clarke quote that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And it feels to me like a perfect place to begin this lecture. The Industrial Revolution, however we might define it, was, in my mind at least, a time of magic. It was a time when the changes wrought on the world were of such magnitude to have been previously unimaginable. And tonight, I would like to introduce a fascinating corner of England to you. I'd like to discuss the origins of industrial activity in this area and the building of the Iron Bridge. Leading on from that, I'd like to cover what people made of the bridge and this tumultuous time and the landscape that it was at the heart of. And finally, I'd like to cover some of the more recent work that we as English Heritage have done to conserve this wonderful structure so that it can remain such a powerful symbol of industry and innovation for centuries to come. But before we go too far, I think it's worth familiarising ourselves with the landscape and the places that we'll be referring to throughout the lecture. Coalbrookdale sits in the middle of the county of Shropshire, the largest landlocked county in the UK. You can see it here marked on the map. But more specifically, we're going to be speaking about an area which I'll refer to as Coalbrookdale. And that sits within the Severn Gorge, which is now more popularly known as the Ironbridge Gorge. It runs roughly northeast to southwest in the centre of the county of Shropshire. Coalbrookdale lies at its western end and runs roughly north-south. You can see it here just at the top left of the screen. The town of Ironbridge, which is all one word, is named after the Iron Bridge, 2 words, and is predominantly on the northern side of the gorge. Today, this whole area is cheek by jowl with the new town of Telford, further to the north, which has subsumed many smaller settlements such as the market town of Wellington and the manor of Madeley, which we'll hear more about later. For the purposes of our story, Coalbrookdale is the nominal focus, but the wider area of the gorge has a rich industrial and human history, but much of the action was played out here with Coalbrookdale as the backdrop. So here we are. This is the Iron Bridge. It spans the Severn Gorge in mid-Shropshire. It was manufactured and it was constructed between 1777 and 1779, and then opened to the public, as we've just heard, New Year's Day, 1781. It now sits right at the heart of the town of Ironbridge, which is now the focus of a World Heritage Site. It was a toll bridge and it served to link the 2 sides of the gorge. And while bucolic today, the fantastic landscape, the gorge has been for many centuries a cradle of industry, with complex industrial processes taking place on both sides of the river. In particular, the area was known for the manufacture of iron. It sits within the East Shropshire coalfield, which provided abundant fuel and with easy access to both iron ore and limestone. While iron is the industry that most people would associate with the area, there was, and still is, a thriving ceramic industry as well. People, materials, and goods needed to cross the river on a daily basis, and this could be dangerous. As such, a bridge was a necessary thing. It met a clear need. It had a purpose. What was unique about this bridge was the fact that it was made of iron. In one sense, there was no need for that. But if we look at the Iron Bridge as a statement of intent, a calling card advertising the skills of the local ironmasters, then we begin to understand why they chose to build it out of this material. And it was the first iron bridge in the world. But more than that, it was the first freestanding structure ever to be made from metal. Now, within 20 years, just a few miles away in Shrewsbury, the world's first iron-framed building was constructed. This is Ditherington Flax Mill, well worth a visit. From this point on, the use of iron and later steel became increasingly common in the construction of buildings, and just over 200 years later, today, the skyline of every major city has been shaped by buildings whose frames are made of metal. We'll come to the history of the bridge in more detail later in this lecture, but for now, this serves by way of an introduction to that fixed point around which the rest of the narrative is built. Now, as was mentioned in the introduction, the main crux of what I'd like to speak about this evening is that the convenient dates and periods that we impose on history are sometimes just that. They're impositions. Of course, we have examples such as 43 AD or 1066, the Roman and Norman invasions respectively, but even then, there are events which led up to these great moments of change. The Iron Bridge is very much seen as a symbol of the Industrial Revolution. But what is the Industrial Revolution? When did it begin? When did it end? For one historian, T.S. Ashton, writing in 1947, admittedly a very old book, but it's one that I return to time and time again, he had it pretty clear. The Industrial Revolution covered the years from 1760 to 1830. For Ashton, the Industrial Revolution was a purely Georgian affair, which is interesting because, of course, today, today we see the age of industry as more closely associated with the reign of Queen Victoria and perhaps the writings of Charles Dickens than we do the Georges and the writings of Jane Austen. In recent decades, it feels as if the discussion may have turned away from more arbitrary dates and towards an assessment of impacts and effects to characterize a given period. This is particularly interesting in discussions surrounding what's been termed the Anthropocene era. The Anthropocene derives its name from the Greek word anthropos, or man, and is now used to cover a period of time where human activity can be seen to be influencing and impacting the geological record. There's been much debate, there has been much debate as to when the Anthropocene as a geological epoch might have begun. In the early 2000s, a suggestion was that it should be recognized as having its origins in the mid-18th century, at exactly the point in time when the Iron Bridge was being built. But more recently, it's been suggested that the middle of the 20th century, when emissions from industry began to increase, and of course the use of nuclear weapons and energy generation released huge quantities of radiation that will be detectable for many centuries to come. But whatever the date, the Anthropocene has entered the lingua franca, and it's here to stay. In geological terms, whether its starting date is 1750 or 1950 is utterly meaningless. The important thing is that we're now changing the world permanently, and it's clear that the Industrial Revolution, however we might define it, has a part to play in the story of that change. The Iron Bridge is undoubtedly now a global symbol of the changes wrought by the Industrial Revolution. But what I would like to suggest is that the Iron Bridge did not come towards the beginning of that period, but rather when it had reached maturity. The manufacture and construction of the bridge was undoubtedly a pivotal moment. But what if it came after almost 250 years of gestation? I like to think it appeared right at the heart of a 500-year period of experimentation and innovation. In this case, the term pivotal moment is completely apt because the late 1770s can be seen as the pivot point where things began to change with increasing, even at times with alarming speed. I'd like to place the Iron Bridge at the centre of this 500-year-long story, one that has its beginnings with the Reformation in the mid-16th century and that runs right up to today. Even at the time of its construction, the Iron Bridge was a powerful symbol, a bold statement of how industry, in this case iron founding, could reshape the world. And reshape the world it certainly did, for the Anthropocene is now all around us. The industrial landscape of the Severn Gorge will forever be linked with the names of the great 18th century ironmasters. 3 generations of the Derby family, Richard Reynolds, and iron mad John Wilkinson, to name but a few. But there's almost a prehistory to industry in the Severn Gorge, and that's equally fascinating and complex. Much of it is covered in a number of fantastic books. I'm reminded of one immediately, Blood, Faith and Iron by Paul Belford, which I draw on for these later sections. The milieu that gave rise to the Iron Bridge and ultimately to the world we live in today began in earnest with the dissolution of the monasteries in the middle of that 16th century, again, a time when everything changed. In 1540, Wenlock Priory was suppressed and the lands and properties became the property of the Crown. In 1544, the manor of Madeley was bought for the princely sum of £946 by a gentleman called Robert Brooke. We see here a lovely image, a reconstruction image produced by our colleagues within English Heritage of Wenlock Priory, probably at about the time of the dissolution. So it's bought by Robert Brooke. While the town of Much Wenlock and its priory are some miles to the southwest, this manor encompassed the area of Coalbrookdale that would later rise to prominence as the site of Derby's family's innovations. The landscape that Robert Brooke bought into was rich in natural resources, including coal and iron ore, and these had been exploited to a limited extent before the dissolution. It was also threaded by numerous streams that could provide water power required to give blast to the furnaces. This was achieved through the use of dams, creating reservoirs of water that could then be harnessed to power water wheels, which in turn powered great bellows. The area was adjacent to the mighty River Severn, which at 220 miles was the longest river in Great Britain. This provided a means of transport for both raw materials and finished goods, and connected the whole area to the wider world in a way that can often be overlooked. Coal and iron were the local industries, but were at this time not quite as closely linked as we might first suspect, as it was charcoal, an organic as opposed to mineral fuel, that was the primary fuel in the production of iron at this time. The use of mineral fuels such as coal or roasted coal, otherwise known as coke, would come later, and it would join these two industries together, focused on the production of this material. The Brooke family set about expanding the industrial exploitation of the area, and by the mid-17th century, there was a very active iron industry, fueled by timber provided by the wooded slopes of the gorge. This was not an unusual occurrence, and across the country, there were landowners beginning to capitalise on the assets held in their newly acquired lands. At Coalbrookdale, iron and steel were starting to be produced in significant quantities, and already the area had a reputation for innovation. Larger and more robust furnaces were constructed. These were large upright shafts, we can see in this wonderful cutaway image here, large upright shafts, perhaps 5 meters square in the overall building of them, several meters tall and around, I'd say maybe sometimes up to 2 meters in diameter on the inside, perhaps more. Unlike the smaller bloomery furnaces that had come before, these large furnaces would be worked 24 hours a day, and the raw materials of iron ore and limestone, along with the charcoal needed for fuel, being fed into the furnace from the open top. And we can see that again in this image. We can see the water wheel here, which is powering the bellows, which provides the air and the blast for the furnace. And we see this charging ramp at the top, and the fuel and the raw materials come into the furnace at the top there. From late autumn to early spring, the furnace would be worked in a months-long campaign that would see huge quantities of iron produced. The furnaces were run in this manner because once the stones and bricks that they were constructed of was properly heated up, you did not want to waste time reheating them or allowing the structure to cool down between these cycles of production. At Coalbrookdale, there were several furnaces built in the 17th century, and one of them, known today as the Old Furnace, more properly the Upper Furnace, still stands to this day, and it bears an iron lintel with the date 1638, which places it firmly at the heart of an industrial revolution powered by charcoal and water. You can see it here in this image. We have the date 1638, and we have a rebus on each side. The B is thought, I think very properly, to relate to the Brooke family. But we can also see that this particular furnace had 2 other lintels added. We can see the name there, Abraham Darby, 1777, and that date is a particularly significant date, and we'll come back to that one in a short while. It's important to see this in a wider national context, though. Iron and steel was produced at furnaces up and down the country in the 17th century. The quantities of fuel required would have been staggering, and even with coppicing providing a relatively sustainable source of timber, by the end of the 17th century, some historians have argued that there was a timber famine. This had been commented on in the early 17th century by the poet Michael Drayton in his voluminous and particularly hard-to-read poem, The Polly Albion. In this, he specifically criticises the iron industries of the Kentish Weald for stripping the landscape of its resources to feed the furnaces. Timber to produce charcoal was deemed to be in such short supply that some historians have even argued that this was one of the motivations for exploring the use of mineral fuel. So we can see how the redistribution of lands and the resources that they provided at the start of the dissolution of monasteries in the mid-16th century kick-started the increase in industrial activity in this corner of Shropshire as well as elsewhere. That mineral wealth, the landscape, and the transport infrastructure provided by the Seven meant that there was real potential for those who had the capital and the innovation to invest, as well as the vision to see that potential. It was into this landscape of industry that a gentleman called Abraham Darby arrived, taking the lease of the upper furnace in 1708 and founding the Coalbrookdale Company. Abraham Darby was a Quaker who had previously been a partner in a company producing brass in Bristol. Now, he'd developed a keen interest in iron founding within Bristol, and as one of his innovations, he patented a process for casting iron pots using a reusable mould. Before this, metal, usually iron or brass vessels, had been cast using clay moulds. And these moulds were broken open so that they were destroyed in the manufacturing process. The idea of a mould that could be used again and again, creating a uniform, consistent product at a much cheaper cost to both manufacturer and, one hopes, the consumer, was something of a revolution in itself. It is, of course, a cornerstone to the concept of industry. It's a move away from the bespoke, craft-made item to a mass-produced, standardized one. And it was a concept that Darby and his descendants made great use of. But within only a year of taking the lease of the Coalbrookdale furnace, it seems as if Abraham Darby was already experimenting with coke, which is roasted coal, as a fuel for his furnaces. This had been attempted previously by other individuals, most notably Dudley in the 1620s, who even acquired a patent from King James. But there were always questions about the quality of the iron that was produced, some of which may have been based on professional jealousy from other iron founders. So commercially, this iron was never particularly a successful experiment. Darby, however, fared much better. While there were initial concerns about the large ingots or pigs of iron that he produced, he managed to produce an iron that was extremely fluid when heated and perfect for casting thin-walled pots, kettles, and other items. At this point, perhaps it's worth standing back and taking stock of what these few short paragraphs mean in terms of the Industrial Revolution. Abraham Darby had developed a commercially successful way of using a mineral fuel in the casting of iron. This fuel was abundant in specific areas of the country, including around Coalbrookdale. Indeed, it must have almost seemed like an endless source of energy at the time. It had a far higher calorific content for its mass than charcoal, which meant that it was more easily transportable, should that be required. What's more, at the same time, Darby had developed an early form of mass production, which also meant that he could produce a standardized product far more cheaply than his competitors. Now, his chosen location, right by the River Severn, gave him an added competitive advantage in terms of getting his product to customers. By the early 18th century, there had been more than 150 years of inexorable industrial development right here in the Severn Gorge. Darby may have moved into a landscape that was already industrialized, but he introduced these key changes that would go on to influence the rest of the country and indeed the rest of the world. The grandson of Abraham Darby III, just to keep things simple, took over the running of the Coalbrookdale Company in 1768. By this time, it was a huge concern. In addition to the many smaller domestic castings being produced, the company had also begun producing large quantities of cast iron cylinders and engine part castings for early stationary steam engines. Now, these machines harnessed the power of steam to propel a piston in a cylinder, which could then be used to actuate a pump, provide rotary motion, or eventually power a blowing engine. These huge engines were a significant step forward in terms of the product produced by the company, and also in terms of the development of industrial processes more generally. The stationary steam engine provided a source of power that was entirely mechanical and did not necessarily rely upon natural resources or the form of the landscape. In time, it would mean that industrial activities no longer had to be located perhaps directly next to a water source or that source of fuel, as you could get your energy brought to you. The steam engine could be erected almost anywhere fuel and water could be brought to it. Arguably, it was the steam engine that meant that heavy industry could eventually migrate to more central locations that were better served by the burgeoning transport links of the canals and so forth. Now, in this print, which I think is particularly beautiful, by Francis Vivares, it dates from 1758, and we can see the landscape of Coalbrookdale and the upper works, and we can see it in action. On the right-hand side, we can see piles of coal being roasted into coke. We have smoke billowing up from the low square chimney right in the center, and that's actually the old furnace, the upper furnace, the one whose lintel we've seen in an earlier image. This was the one taken over by Abraham Darby in the early years of the century. The houses of the Darby family can be seen just behind to the right, while in the foreground we see a completed casting being taken away from the furnace. And this is clearly a casting of a large cylinder for a steam engine. Presumably it's being taken away to a client. It's interesting to note that in this depiction, the roads are being used to transport this particularly heavy casting. Now, I know this area relatively well, and this feels challenging, as the wagon would have to take that heavy item up some very steep inclines out of Coalbrookdale and complete the journey on roads of varying quality at the time. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, for some years in the middle part of the 18th century, there had been talk of a bridge across the River Severn, joining the two sides of the gorge together and allowing for the movement of raw materials and indeed finished goods such as this. The Severn was crossed by means of several ferries, but it could be a dangerous crossing, especially when the river was in spate. Now, by 1775, a group of local ironmasters and businessmen had formed a group of subscribers to look into funding the construction of just such a bridge. And Abraham Darby III, who was working at the furnace, making these fantastic castings, was elected to be its treasurer. Just over £3,000 was raised for the bridge's construction. In 1776, an Act of Parliament was passed, enabling the bridge to be built, and by 1777, casting of the huge iron ribs of the bridge had begun. So here we see another view of Coalbrookdale. This is one of a pair by an artist called William Williams. We'll see another of his paintings in a second. Now, this painting was made in 1777, just at the time construction of the bridge was beginning. So we're seeing the Coalbrookdale works at exactly that point in time when the bridge is starting to be cast. Now, the Vivares print that we've just seen previously is very descriptive. And portrayed the landscape of industry almost in technical terms, whereas this work takes a more painterly view of the scene. There are strong elements of the picturesque in the wider landscape, and we're given visual clues that this painting, that this scene, is really something worth looking at by the inclusion of the figures who are themselves viewing that scene. But at the heart of it is something of the sublime. Engine houses, wagon ways, blazing fires, and gouts of grey and black smoke. This did not appear overnight. This had been growing here in this secluded valley for centuries, and Coalbrookdale was about to make its mark on the world in no uncertain terms. The construction of the bridge is still a subject of some debate, and we have tantalizing glimpses provided by some wonderful sketchy images. However, experimental archaeology in 2001 provided a fascinating insight into how it may have been completed. But the construction of the bridge, the technical side of it, is a complex story, and unfortunately not one we necessarily have time for tonight. But suffice to say, the bridge was cast, constructed between 1777 and 1779. Once complete, the bridge was open to traffic on New Year's Day, 1781. It was a bold statement about the skills, ability, and the ambition of the ironmasters of the area. Darby had commissioned a painting of the bridge by the artist William Williams in 1780, bearing in mind this is the year before the bridge was actually opened. And this painting was exhibited in London, almost by way of a calling card. In this painting, we see the bridge in all its glory. Not open to the public at the time, it was painted as the roadways had yet to be completed. It still has a carriage flying across. As with Williams's previous painting of Coalbrookdale, there is a gentleman, this time in a boat, right at the centre, at the front of the painting, and he's helpfully mansplaining the scene to his two female companions, who clearly have no way to escape. Once again, we have the rough, picturesque landscape at the margins, but in the centre, we have industry. The bridge is the focal point, but also it frames the lead smelters, the engine houses, and the masts of the many barges on the river. This painting, this bridge, was an open invitation to the chattering classes in the capital to come and look upon this work and to wonder. And indeed, they did come. The bridge was received by some with rapture and others with a sense of sublime horror. It was painted multiple times by artists. It became part of what could essentially be seen as a British grand tour at a time in the early 19th century when travel to the continent was restricted due to the Napoleonic Wars. Poets and writers described the landscape that they had simply never encountered before. A landscape of industry, almost 250 years in the making. In reading the words of these people, one is struck by the continued use of mythological metaphors. Naiads and dryads and natural spirits inhabit that beautiful picturesque landscape, while Cyclops is often seen as embodying the rapacious nature of industry, and the fires of the furnaces are likened to those of the underworld or to artificial strombolis in one particular passage. In this particular painting of 1801 by Philip James de Loutherbourg, we see Coalbrookdale by night. Actually, it depicts the Bedlam or Madeley Wood furnaces in what would now be deemed the modern town of Ironbridge, but one gets a sense of the fierce nature of this crucible of industry. One commentator in the 1830s, Charles Hulbert, said this about his impression of the place. The flaming furnaces and smoking lime kilns form a spectacle horribly sublime, while the stupendous iron arch, the bridge, striding over the chasm, presents to the mind an idea of that fatal bridge made by sin and death over chaos, from the boundaries of hell to the walls of this now defenseless world. There are so many wonderful quotes about the bridge and this area, but this one in particular speaks to me about the idea of something irrevocably changed. It draws on the 10th book of Milton's Paradise Lost, with its allusion to a bridge or causeway that linked hell to our own world. The idea that the world was now defenseless in the face of industry is particularly profound, I feel, especially as now, looking back almost 250 years from the construction of the bridge, we can see how radically changed our world has become. But a town grew up around the bridge to accommodate the tourists. The trustees of the bridge themselves had a bright idea, and they built an inn right by the bridge in 1784, and they named it, interestingly, after the particular agreement that was in place to provide a lifetime income for the various shareholders. It was called the Tontine Inn. You can still visit it to this day. They made their money from people crossing the bridge, but were astute enough to realize that they could also make money from charging tourists for food and accommodation when they came to the area to visit. The town, unsurprisingly, became known as Ironbridge. As the 19th century wore on, industry in the Severn Gorge at first flourished and then slowly began to decline. We see this wonderful picture, probably about 1912, of workers at one of the larger furnaces in the area, the Madeley Wood Company furnaces. The innovations that were in large part developed in the area sowed the seeds of the area's decline. The use of mineral fuel and the development of steam engines meant it was no longer essential to locate your business where the topography and natural assets dictated. The development of canals and later the railways, and here I need to just say that Coalbrookdale played a fascinating part in the development of the early railways, right from the earliest part of the 17th century. But again, I'm afraid that'll have to be saved for another night. But the development of the canals and the railways created a transport network that was no longer reliant on the great rivers such as the Severn. Heavy industry began to cluster around the nearby Black Country, a location far more central and more accessible than before. And eventually, cities like Birmingham would take up the mantle of heavy industry, leaving places such as Coalbrookdale, with its tradition of industry already centuries old, to become something like backwaters, almost forgotten in some people's minds until the rise in interest in industrial heritage in the middle part of the 20th century. So the Iron Bridge was born out of tumult and change, the old world giving way to the new, and it stood for almost 250 years and been a witness to so much: floods, earthquakes even, and elephants, as we can see from this rather charming image of an elephant advertising a circus crossing over the Iron Bridge. In that time, it has been repainted, strengthened, and repaired. But moving forwards many years, in 2017, there was a recognition that, for the bridge to stand for another 250 years, we would need to do more than just piecemeal work, and a full conservation project was undertaken. Following a major survey, and you can see this here, this image of the Iron Bridge, it's so very different, isn't it, to the William Williams with its picturesque landscape and the sublime. When we render this using computer survey, we get an absolutely accurate representation of the brick by brick of the bridge and rib by rib. But perhaps it just isn't the same as seeing these fantastic painterly representations of it that we saw in the 18th century. So following this major survey, every inch of the bridge was cleaned back to bare metal. Joints were looked at, cracks assessed, and repairs undertaken in a project that cost £3.6 million, generously supported by the Hermann Riemsper Foundation in Germany. But this wasn't a restoration project, it was a conservation project. It was the largest one undertaken by English Heritage since becoming a charity in 2015. The project required a fascinating mix of engineering and craft skills, as each piece was examined and failed components were replaced. And the entire bridge, as you can see here, was swathed in scaffolding. And although the bridge remained open to pedestrians, a new temporary walkway was constructed to the side, which enabled visitors to glimpse the work as it was undertaken. And volunteers were on hand to talk about the bridge and its rich history, the significance to the area, and to highlight the need for this conservation project. And we can see here in this image, here it is wrapped in plastic. It's almost like it's been shrink wrapped, scaffolding all the way around. And then this black stripe that you can see in the image, that's the walkway that we put in so that people could have a sort of low level access and peer through to have a look at the work that was taking place there. And also, in some sense, it was compensation, because many people came sometimes from long distances, sometimes from abroad, to see the bridge and take that photograph. If they arrive in the gorge and they find it shrink wrapped, it could be a disappointment. But what was fantastic was it was so well received. People would come, they would see the bridge like this, but rather than being disappointed, they were drawn in by the volunteers, the hard work of the volunteers, and engaged in conversations about the work that was taking place here. So it was a really effective way to sort of kickstart the project, but also to bring people along with us. A safety boat had to be present at all times in the water whilst work was taking place to safeguard the team should anyone actually fall from the scaffolding. Something that never occurred to me actually until I went into the scaffolding and was thinking, yeah, of course, that makes sense. And this was a job that required patience and many, many layers of warm and waterproof clothing. In this image, we can see the internals of the bridge on one of the lower scaffold platforms. The elements of the bridge are being inspected and areas of rot identified and repaired. And you can also see here that we've got the original castings, these large castings, these beautiful rounded shapes. But we can also see that there's been, over the years, much patching. So you can see these bolts coming through here, clamps and patches. This was the kind of thing that needed to be looked at. And it needed to be looked at as a whole so that we could really address all of those issues and ensure that the bridge was absolutely up to the standard we wanted it to be. But perhaps the most immediately noticeable result of the project was around the repainting of the bridge. There are many historic images of the Iron Bridge, and many of these are coloured, which is quite rare actually. It's nice that we have that record. But there's long been speculation about the original colour of the bridge when it was first opened, with many people arguing that it was initially painted black. So here's the star image. It's like an impenetrable image here, but I'll do my best to explain it to you. Working with specialists and using paint samples taken from both the structure itself and from elements of the bridge that had become detached and were held in store by the Iron Bridge Gorge Museum Trust, it was possible to discern faint traces of the original paint layers adhering to the surface of the cast iron. And this paint was a deep mahogany red-brown. Now let's see what I can do with this image. At the bottom of the image, that's the actual cast iron itself. And we can see adhering to that cast iron these flakes of a sort of reddy brown paint, and you can see it comes in layers, rather like some layers of multicolored sand you might get from the Isle of Wight. So we can see all of those building up there, and then at the top we can see a very, very thick layer of thick black paint. It was useful to use the detached elements of the bridge because, of course, those could have come off the bridge quite some time ago and not been sandblasted back and repainted, say in the later part of the 20th century. So those are the ones where we held out the most hope of finding evidence such as this. Now this red-brown precisely matched the colour of the bridge in the 1780 painting by William Williams that we've already seen. But it's interesting to see that the bridge is predominantly painted black in subsequent renderings. And again, the paint research provided a possible answer to that. Under the microscope, it was possible to see several reapplications of this sort of mahogany-coloured paint with extremely dark, almost black layers in between. And it seems highly likely that the polluted atmosphere of the gorge in its industrial heyday effectively turned the red-brown bridge black in the space of a few years. It was then repainted again red-brown, but became darker each time. And it's possible, though we don't know, it's possible that after several instances of repainting mahogany, it was painted black just to save the trouble. So in January 2019, the project was completed and the bridge fully reopened to the public, resplendent in its new colour. And you can see these two images together. In one sense, of course, the answer was staring us in the face all along, but the paint samples provided us with the corroboration, as it were, of this beautiful painting. This icon of the long industrial revolution, safeguarded now, we hope, for centuries to come. So to conclude, I would like you to imagine yourself standing on the Iron Bridge and, metaphorically speaking, looking back almost 250 years. I like to think that when you're looking back there, we can just about in the distance see the Reformation, a religious revolution that radically changed Britain, the ramifications of which are still felt and seen across the country today. Out of that turmoil was born another revolution, the Industrial Revolution. Now, this began in a small way, in areas with the appropriate landscape and resources to enable innovation, but it quickly grew. Coal became the fuel for this revolution and iron perhaps its greatest product. The Iron Bridge was and is a symbol of 18th century industry, a time when it felt like the world could be changed, rebuilt anew. But to me, it has its origins much further back in our nation's history. And now, imagining you're still standing on the bridge, turn 180 degrees and look in the opposite direction, this time into the future, looking forward 250 years from the date that the bridge was built, right to today. Now we see a world of wood and water reshaped with iron, steel, coal and steam. We see first the rivers, then the canals, and then the railways. We see the steam engine, the cotton mills, the growth of cities. We see coal give way to oil. We see a world made smaller, the annihilation of space and time, as it was called. While at the same time, our opportunities and possibilities grew. And we also begin to see, right at the end of our view, close to today, the dawning realization that we have indeed changed the world, but that those changes may not all be for the better. At every point in history, there are challenges to be overcome, and the Iron Bridge is an example of how a complex series of events can, over a long period of time, lead to great changes. Looking around today, I'm fascinated with the idea with the idea of what might be symbolic of the challenges we have to overcome. Heritage is all about what we pass on to the next generation. What monument, what symbol might we leave behind to represent our struggles and our innovation? The Iron Bridge sits at the heart of the Industrial Revolution. Once again, we find ourselves in a period of upheaval and change. It's time for us to think about what, in 250 years' time, will be our own legacy. Thank you very much for your time.
Matt, thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. Thank you for heroically soldiering on. We'll just give you a couple of seconds, hopefully, to get your throat back in order. But that was very, very interesting, the historical perspective, but also very topical on a day when the world is thinking about the exploitation of mineral resources, as you had said. Please do send us your questions. We'd love to have some, but we have some already. Please keep them coming in. And I'd like to start off with a question from Marcus, who asks, was this the only iron bridge in progress at the time, or was it just the first that reached the finish line?
It's a really good question, actually. I would say that there's tantalizing evidence of other bridges being constructed out of iron, the garden bridges, more decorative bridges. You hear about these in the sources, both in Europe and in Britain. But really, I think put it another way, we find that very quickly there are other bridges and structures being made out of iron. But this, of course, is the one that has stood the test of time, that we know came at a very early period. But I think it's always a challenge to say, is this the first? Because one never knows what might be discovered in a few years' time. That in fact, to make bold claims about something being the first ever, well, I think I do at the beginning of the talk because it makes sense and it feels right. But I do it with a caveat that we may well discover that there are other structures that predated it. I don't know of any right now, not that would match it for scale. So yeah, that'll be my answer. And I guess there is always that caveat about marking something about being the first of its type.
Thanks very much. A question from Tristan: who designed the bridge? Do we know? And was it Darby himself?
No, it wasn't Darby. Again, that's a really good question. It's a chap called Thomas Farnells Pritchard, an architect who worked within the Shropshire area. Unfortunately, he never lived to see the bridge completed. So because he died, and so excuse me, everybody. So it would appear that actually a great deal of the finished design as built was actually from Darby, but the original drawings were by Pritchard. But you can see when you look at those early drawings that it is a different shape. It's not quite the full rounded arch that we see today.
Thanks very much. On the subject of design, we've got a number of questions that ask pretty much the same thing, which is, I understand that the bridge mimics building techniques using wood, timber. Is that correct?
I love that question because we saw in some of the images that you can see there's sort of bolts and plates holding bits and whatever together. But the original structure does show signs, well, not just signs, it does demonstrate woodworking techniques for actually constructing the bridge. We can see kind of open dovetail joints and lap joints and the like that you would see perhaps in a timber framed house. Few things that you want to think about there. I mean, the first thing is that these component parts were cast in open sand molds. So you basically got a large bed of sand, and then you created a wooden model of what it is you wanted to cast. You pushed that into the sand, and then you ran your iron in there, which is why you see that Three sides, so the two shallow sides and one long face, are relatively smooth, and then the back face of many of the castings is very, very lumpy because that was open to the air. So these wooden patterns, they were made out of wood. So originally those pieces were all made out of wood. And so it would, of course, seem to make sense that the way in which you put them together was using jointing techniques that people would have been very familiar with. And I suppose it takes a little while when you're using a material in a new way to really optimize the use of that material. And I think that's what we see. A favorite word is a skewmorph, something that's kind of, it looks like something, but isn't quite. And that's sort of what the bridge is, really. The earlier bits are certainly using these timber techniques. And that makes sense for the time, but we see that rapidly change when you look at the additional elements.
Okay, thanks. Now I've got pretty much the same question from June and from Chris. June asks, do I understand that there was a year's delay between completion and opening? If so, why? Was the bridge built in pieces or as a whole?
So yeah, the bridge was built sort of in over that period between 77 and 79. And it's been through a number of changes as abutments have changed and additional elements have changed from timber to metal. But the reason why it was opened in 1781 is because they were building the roadways, effectively, the abutments and the roadways to get people there. So the bridge would have stood for a period of time, unable to be used by people, but this incredible symbol until they've kind of actually got the roadways in there to enable people to cross the river and do what they're supposed to do with it.
Okay, thanks very much. And on the roadway, possibly a quick question from Elaine. Is there a reason why the roadway isn't flat?
Excuse me. I assume what we're looking at here is the sort of the angle that we have that plane there. Do you know what? Couldn't be categorical on that, but it is designed that way. The idea that it kind of reaches up with that sort of gentle slope is part of the design. Now there must be, and I'm sure there'll be engineers out there shouting at the screen right now why it's optimal to have that. Maybe it's rainwater runoff. I'm not sure, but I think what I can say is, it's deliberate, and we see that shape, that form, in the earliest depictions of the bridge, such as in the William Williams painting. So it's not necessarily that it started off flat and has buckled, although of course we do know that the bridge has shifted a little bit over time, but we can see that that's part of it.
Okay, thanks very much. And a question from Sue. As different types of iron, cast or wrought iron or steel, have different properties, what are the loading limitations of the bridge, and how would these be different if it were, say, a steel bridge?
Wow, that is a technical question, and one I would feel I don't have the public liability to answer with confidence. But there's a very good point made there that cast iron has certain properties. It's particularly good in compression, whereas wrought iron has higher what's called ductility, so it can flex more. So of course, the bridge itself is kind of quite fixed and static because of the type of material it is. It can take a great deal of weight on top of it, like the elephant. We saw that. Of course, it was open to traffic, until the first third of the 20th century. But it wouldn't take a great deal of sort of lateral movement, which of course is why we found a number of fractures in there. But I really couldn't comment on the sort of the technical properties of the different types of iron and steel.
Okay, thanks. We've got a couple of questions about the legacy of the Iron Bridge. And the first one from Michael. Was the Iron Bridge a commercial success in its own time? Did the subscribers make a return on their investment?
Yeah, it was a commercial success, actually. I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what they made there, but it was a commercial success. But we have to remember that it was very expensive. It did go over budget. Abraham Darby did put in the third did put in a lot of additional funds there, but these were very astute businessmen. So yeah, it was a success. And of course, the tolls have now been removed, but certainly its kind of its utility to the wider community after almost 250 years is still there. So it has been, I would say, it's been not just a commercial success, but it's been a success in every aspect.
Thanks very much. And Jeff asks, do we know whether any of the later well-known engineers like Telford, Brunel or Stevenson viewed and took any inspiration from the Iron Bridge?
I couldn't give exact references, but yeah, definitely. Of course, Thomas Telford was very active, very active in the Shropshire area, Shrewsbury Castle, all sorts, road building and what have you. So yeah, undoubtedly he would have looked at it, but it's been an inspiration for many, many people over the years. Like I say, I couldn't put my hand on the references or the quotes, but I certainly have.
Okay, I think we're getting close to the end of time, but we've got a couple of questions which again are very similar. One from Trevor and one from John, both of them very similar. Did the design of the bridge allow for expansion of the metal in hot weather?
Not that I'm... God, that is a really good question, isn't it? I just don't know, and I don't know. Is the source material that says we're allowing a 1/16 of an inch for expansion? I suspect probably not. But having said that, the bridge is clearly a sophisticated structure. It's clearly a structure that's been thought about. So whilst they might not have built that into the design consciously, there was clearly an understanding of the properties of the material they were using to one degree or another. You have to remember that when you're casting iron, that's going to shrink by a given percentage, in length and in all sorts of dimensions. So that they would have had to compensate for that when they were creating the patterns and when they were actually casting those parts. Now, I know that's different to expansion, allowing it to expand in hot weather, but I guess what I'm trying to say is, whilst they were still using a relatively new material, they were thinking about it in a really, really sophisticated manner. So perhaps they didn't include that, but I think what we can say is that the engineers working on the project had a great understanding of their craft.
Thanks very much, Matt. And I'm afraid that it's now time to bring things to a close. We haven't been able to answer all of your questions, but we'll see if we can actually get answers for them. So keep watching the English Heritage website. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We'll be sending you out a link to a short survey just to hear your thoughts and understand what topics you're interested to hear more about. We'd be very grateful if you could find a few minutes to fill it in. So thank you for that. I hope you'll be able to join us in a month for Dominique Bouchard, who'll be delving into one of the most important legal decisions, but the one that most people have never heard of, the case of Somerset versus Stuart. This case was instrumental in Britain's eventual abolition of slavery and the slave trade. But much about the central figure in this case, James Somerset, remains a mystery even today. Please do join us for what promises to be another fascinating evening. But thank you once again to Matt for such a fantastic lecture. Thank you to all of you, our wonderful members. It's only thanks to your support that we're able to care for our sites such as the Iron Bridge and share their tales. Thank you once again and good night.